Viewer advisory. The events you are about to witness are based on a true story. Some scenes may be deeply unsettling for certain audiences. Viewer discretion is strongly recommended. The snow fell thick and silent on that December night in 1983, blanketing Detroit's crumbling streets in a deceptive peace. Somewhere in the darkness, flames erupted against the winter sky, consuming metal, flesh, and what everyone believed was the truth. But death, as it turned out, was just the beginning of a lie that would span 3 decades. Picture this: a man declared dead, his grieving widow collecting over $1 million in insurance money, and a quiet disappearance that no one questioned. For 33 years, the case file gathered dust in a basement archive, another tragic accident in a city that had seen too many, until one broken taillight on a quiet Alabama road pulled the past from its grave and revealed that some secrets refused to stay buried. This is the story of Alvin Johnson, the man who died twice. Tonight's story is one that will leave you rattled. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, let's begin. In the winter of 1983, Detroit was a city bleeding out. The automotive industry had collapsed, taking with it the dreams of thousands of working families. Empty factories stood like tombstones against the skyline, and entire neighborhoods had been abandoned to decay and desperation. It was in this dying city that Alvin and Gloria Johnson were slowly drowning. Alvin was 36, a man whose hands told the story of hard labor, callous from construction work, scarred from electrical jobs, weathered from years of scraping together whatever employment he could find. He moved from site to site like a ghost, installing drywall one week, fixing wiring the next, always uncertain where the next paycheck would come from. His wife, Gloria, 34, worked the graveyard shift at Detroit General Hospital, pushing a mop through endless corridors while the city slept. She knew every stain on those floors, every crack in the walls, every corner where desperation echoed in the empty halls. Their life had become a suffocating routine of survival. The red brick house on Jefferson Avenue that had once represented their American dream was now a burden they couldn't bear. Mortgage payments had fallen behind. The heating bill sat unpaid on the kitchen table next to final notices from the electric company. Their aging Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme rattled and wheezed through Detroit's pothole-riddled streets, burning oil and their last hopes along with it. Some nights, Gloria would sit at that kitchen table, surrounded by overdue bills, and stare at the insurance policy documents that had arrived in the mail. 3 different companies, 3 different policies, all bearing her husband's name. The premiums had been steep, requiring them to skip meals and let other bills slide even further behind. But the potential payout was staggering, $1.5 million. Enough to escape. Enough to disappear. Enough to start over. The plan they hatched was born from desperation, nurtured by poverty, and executed with the cold calculation of people who had nothing left to lose. It would require the ultimate sacrifice, not of Alvin's life, but of someone else's. Walter Spencer was 42 years old and had been invisible for most of those years. He drifted between Detroit's homeless shelters, carried his belongings in a torn duffel bag, and warmed his hands over barrel fires in abandoned lots. To the world, Walter was already a ghost. No family looking for him, no employer expecting him, no address where his absence would be noticed. In a city full of forgotten people, Walter Spencer was the most forgotten of all. The shelter logs at Sacred Heart Mission showed that Walter had signed in for his last meal on December 10, 1983. He'd had the fish sandwich and coffee, same as always. He'd taken his usual spot at the long table near the back, avoiding eye contact, speaking to no one. That night, he'd slept on cot number 14, and by morning, he was gone. No one at the shelter reported him missing because men like Walter came and went like the wind. But Walter Spencer hadn't simply moved on to another shelter. He'd been noticed, selected, chosen for a role he would never understand. On the night of December 14th, as snow began to fall across Detroit, Alvin Johnson made his way to an abandoned garage on the city's east side. The building had been left empty for months, another casualty of the economic collapse. Inside, Walter Spencer lay unconscious on the concrete floor, overcome by alcohol that had been freely given and perhaps something stronger that he hadn't requested. What happened next would haunt the investigators who would eventually piece it together. Alvin Johnson, a man driven to desperation by circumstances beyond his control, became something darker that night. He loaded Walter's limp body into the driver's seat of the old Oldsmobile, arranging him behind the wheel with the practiced efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times. Personal effects were scattered throughout the car. Alvin's wallet, his tools, his wedding ring engraved with the letters G and A. Everything needed to establish identity in an era before DNA testing and digital forensics. Everything needed to make Walter Spencer disappear and Alvin Johnson die in his place. The location had been chosen carefully. A stretch of icy highway just outside city limits, isolated enough to avoid witnesses but traveled enough to ensure discovery. Alvin positioned the car at an angle, using a metal tool to wedge the accelerator pedal down. The vehicle lurched forward, gaining speed on the slick road before slamming into a massive oak tree with devastating force. The impact was tremendous, crushing the driver's side and trapping Walter's body inside. But the crash alone wasn't enough. Alvin had come prepared with a container of gasoline and a crude timing device fashioned from household materials. He doused the interior of the car, lit his makeshift fuse, and ran into the darkness as flames began to consume the vehicle and everything inside it. 20 minutes later, a long-haul truck driver spotted the fire through the trees and radioed for help. By the time firefighters arrived, the Oldsmobile was a burning shell, and Walter Spencer was gone forever, reduced to charred remains that would be buried under another man's name. The investigation that followed was routine and unremarkable. In a city overwhelmed by real emergencies, a straightforward car accident warranted little scrutiny. The personal effects found at the scene matched the vehicle registration. The dental records that Gloria provided matched the remains. The insurance companies, operating without modern fraud detection systems, processed the claims with minimal question. Within weeks, the case was closed and Gloria Johnson was wealthy. By February 1984, she had vanished from Detroit as completely as her husband had supposedly died. She sold their house, settled their debts, and told neighbors she was moving south to be with family. No one questioned it. No one followed up. In a neighborhood where people frequently disappeared, sometimes by choice, sometimes not, Gloria's departure was just another story of someone seeking a better life elsewhere. But Gloria Johnson hadn't really left. She had simply become Margaret Harris. The transformation was gradual and methodical. The couple spent months in temporary locations, establishing new identities through a network of document mills that flourished in the 1980s. Birth certificates, social security numbers, employment histories, all could be purchased if you knew where to look and had enough cash to pay for quality work. By the summer of 1984, Leonard and Margaret Harris emerged in the small town of Grantsville, Alabama, as a quiet couple seeking a peaceful retirement. They paid cash for their modest home, kept to themselves, and slowly integrated into a community that asked few questions and demanded even fewer answers. For over 30 years, they lived this lie with remarkable discipline. Leonard took occasional odd jobs, electrical work, minor repairs, always for cash, always below the radar. Margaret crafted quilts by hand, selling them at church fundraisers and local markets. They attended community events sparingly, maintained their property meticulously, and never did anything to draw attention to themselves. The insurance money that had funded their new life was carefully managed through a network of investments and accounts designed to avoid detection. They never lived lavishly, never made large purchases, never traveled extensively. They understood that invisibility was their greatest asset, and they cultivated it like a garden. Their neighbors in Grantsville knew them as Leonard and Margaret Harris, the quiet couple who kept their yard neat and minded their own business. The kind of people you might wave to from across the street, but never really get to know. The kind of people whose absence you might not notice for days. But on that hot Tuesday afternoon in August 2016, when Margaret fell in the backyard while hanging laundry, their carefully constructed world began to crumble. The injury to her hip was serious enough to require medical attention, and Leonard, who hadn't driven in years, reluctantly pulled their old Ford pickup from the garage. The broken taillight that caught the attention of that patrol officer was such a small thing, a tiny malfunction that should have resulted in nothing more than a warning or a minor citation. But when Officer Danny Rodriguez ran Leonard's license through the system and it came back with an error, routine procedure demanded further verification. At the Grantsville police station, Leonard Harris remained calm as they took his photograph and scanned his fingerprints. He had lived with this false identity for so long that it had become real to him. He answered questions politely, provided the same information that appeared on his license, and showed no signs of concern. In his mind, he was Leonard Harris. That other name, that other life, that terrible night in December 1983, all of it felt like something that had happened to someone else. But fingerprints don't lie, and the digital databases that hadn't existed in the 1980s had perfect memories. When a scan came back matching a juvenile arrest record for Alvin Johnson from 1964, and then cross-referenced with a death certificate from 1983, the impossible became undeniable. The dead had returned, and the past had come calling. Detective Sheila Moore had seen her share of cold cases, but nothing quite like this. When a request came in from Alabama asking her to verify the status of a man who had supposedly died in her jurisdiction over 3 decades ago, she approached it with the methodical precision that had defined her 23-year career. The original case file, retrieved from deep storage, painted a picture of tragedy and routine closure. Car accident, fatal fire, grieving widow, insurance payout, case closed. Nothing had seemed unusual at the time. Nothing had raised red flags. But in the harsh light of modern forensic science, and with the benefit of digital record-keeping, the cracks in the story became chasms. The exhumation of the body buried under Alvin Johnson's name was a surreal experience for everyone involved. After 33 years in the ground, the casket yielded skeletal remains that told a different story than the one recorded in the death certificate. DNA analysis confirmed what the fingerprint match had already suggested. The man buried in that grave was not Alvin Johnson. The identification of Walter Spencer through medical records from a free clinic brought a profound sadness to the investigation. Here was a man who had lived and died in anonymity, whose disappearance had gone unnoticed, whose death had been stolen and used to serve someone else's elaborate deception. Walter Spencer had been a victim twice. First of the circumstances that had led him to life on the streets, and then of 2 people who had seen his invisibility as an opportunity. When the financial forensics team traced the careful money laundering operation that had sustained Leonard and Margaret Harris for decades, the full scope of their deception became clear. They had taken their crime and stretched it across time, parceling out their stolen fortune in careful amounts, living modestly enough to avoid attention while secretly building a comfortable life funded by murder and fraud. The confrontation with truth came gradually for the couple who had become so accustomed to their assumed identities that they had almost forgotten who they really were. In separate interrogation rooms, faced with DNA evidence, financial records, and fingerprint matches that couldn't be explained away, their decades-long performance finally came to an end. Gloria broke first. Perhaps it was the weight of carrying the secret for so many years. Or perhaps it was the relief of finally being able to speak honestly after 3 decades of carefully constructed lies. Her confession filled in the details that Alvin's statement had left vague. She described the planning, the selection of Walter Spencer, the execution of their scheme, and the years of careful concealment that followed. She spoke of sleepless nights in those early years, jumping at every knock on the door, scanning every news report for any mention of their case. She described the gradual transition from fear to confidence as months turned to years and no one came looking for them. She talked about how Leonard Harris and Margaret Harris had slowly become more real to them than Alvin and Gloria Johnson had ever been. But she also spoke of the guilt that had never entirely left them. The knowledge that Walter Spencer's death had been stolen, his identity erased, his existence reduced to anonymous bones in someone else's grave. She said they had tried to convince themselves that Walter was already dying on the streets, that they had simply accelerated an inevitable end. But the rationalization had never fully silenced the voice in her head that reminded her they had taken a life. The trial that followed was a media sensation, though the couple at its center seemed strangely diminished by the attention. After decades of invisibility, Leonard and Margaret Harris appeared almost translucent under the courtroom lights. They were elderly now, their faces lined with age and the weight of carrying their secret. The people who had committed murder and fraud in 1983 had been young and desperate. The people who sat in the defendants' chairs were tired and defeated. The prosecution painted a picture of calculated cruelty. Two people who had identified the most vulnerable member of society and had murdered him to fund their own escape from responsibility. They emphasized the premeditation involved in purchasing multiple insurance policies, the cold selection of a victim who wouldn't be missed, and the callous disposal of Walter Spencer's identity along with his life. The defense argued for mercy, pointing to the desperation that had driven their clients to such extreme measures, the decades they had lived as law-abiding citizens, and their advanced age. They painted a picture of two people who had made a terrible decision in their youth and had been haunted by it ever since. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury's verdict was swift. Alvin Johnson was convicted of second-degree murder, insurance fraud, and identity theft. Gloria Johnson received convictions for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. The sentences reflected both the severity of their crimes and their cooperation with authorities. Alvin was sentenced to 35 years in prison, though at 69 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. Gloria received 25 years, with the possibility of parole after 18. Both sentences carried additional fines and restitution orders, totaling nearly $3 million, the original insurance payouts plus interest and penalties. As they were led from the courtroom in shackles, the couple who had spent over half their lives as Leonard and Margaret Harris looked back at each other one final time. The elaborate performance that had sustained them for 3 decades was finally over. The curtain had fallen, and the audience had delivered its verdict. But perhaps the most important moment came after the trial, during the victim impact statements. Walter Spencer had no family to speak for him, no loved ones to demand justice on his behalf. Instead, representatives from Detroit's homeless advocacy organizations stood to honor his memory. They spoke of the humanity that had been stolen from Walter, the dignity that had been denied him even in death. A small memorial service was held for Walter Spencer at the shelter where he had taken his last meal. His remains, finally identified and acknowledged, were given a proper burial with his real name on the headstone. For the first time in over 30 years, Walter Spencer existed as himself, not as a prop in someone else's deception, but as a human being whose life had mattered. The investigation revealed that Walter had been a veteran who had struggled with addiction and mental health issues after returning from military service. He had family who had lost touch with him years earlier, and when they learned of his fate, they traveled to Detroit to attend his reburial. The man who had died alone and unclaimed was finally mourned by people who remembered him as he had been, not as the nameless victim he had become. Detective Sheila Moore, who had spent months unraveling the 3-decade deception, spoke at the sentencing hearing about the importance of remembering victims whose voices had been silenced. She noted that while Alvin and Gloria Johnson would spend their remaining years in prison, they had already stolen Walter Spencer's remaining years and used them to fund a life of freedom and comfort. Justice, she said, isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about restoring dignity to the innocent. Walter Spencer's name is finally on his grave, and that matters. The case had broader implications for the insurance industry and law enforcement. The ease with which the Johnsons had obtained multiple policies and executed their fraud led to significant changes in how insurance companies verify claims and coordinate with each other. Database systems that might have caught the overlapping policies in the 1980s became standard practice by the 1990s, partly in response to cases like this one. For the town of Grantsville, the revelation that Leonard and Margaret Harris had been living among them under false identities was a shock that reverberated through the tight-knit community for months. Neighbors who had known them for decades struggled to reconcile the quiet, helpful couple they thought they knew with the criminals who had committed murder and lived on the proceeds for over 30 years. Some felt betrayed, others felt manipulated, and a few admitted to a grudging respect for the discipline it had taken to maintain such an elaborate deception for so long. The house on Sycamore Lane stood empty for months after their arrest, a constant reminder that even in the smallest, quietest communities, the past could be hiding in plain sight. The story of Alvin and Gloria Johnson serves as a chilling reminder that some of the most elaborate crimes are committed not by criminal masterminds, but by ordinary people pushed to extraordinary desperation. Their scheme succeeded for decades, not because it was brilliantly conceived, but because it was patiently executed. They understood that the best way to hide was to become unremarkable, to live so quietly that no one would think to look beneath the surface. But time has a way of catching up with even the most carefully buried secrets. Technology advances, databases connect, and sometimes a broken taillight on a quiet road can illuminate truths that have been hidden in darkness for decades. In the end, Alvin Johnson discovered that you can't really escape the past. You can only postpone its arrival. The man who had died twice would spend his real final years behind bars, and the woman who had grieved him publicly while celebrating privately would join him there. Walter Spencer, the forgotten man whose death had been stolen and whose identity had been erased, finally received the recognition and respect that had been denied him in life. The case file that had been marked closed in 1983 was finally, truly closed in 2017. But this time, the ending was different. This time, justice had been served not just to the perpetrators, but to the victim whose name had been lost for so long. Walter Spencer's grave now bears his real name, and visitors sometimes leave flowers there, tokens of remembrance for a man who had been forgotten by society, but not by history. The snow still falls in Detroit winters, and the city still struggles with poverty and desperation. But somewhere in the archives, Detective Moore's case file serves as a testament to the truth that some people go to extraordinary lengths to escape, and the even more extraordinary lengths that justice will go to catch up with them. Sometimes the most shocking crimes aren't committed by strangers in dark alleys, but by neighbors you pass on the street, people who smile and wave and live their lives so convincingly that even they begin to believe them. But fingerprints don't lie, DNA doesn't forget, and eventually, even the most carefully constructed deception will crack under the weight of its own contradictions. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you haven't already, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We upload new true crime content daily, covering cases you know and many you don't. Stick with us as we bring you more stories that deserve to be heard. See you in the next video.